Welcome, friend. Dr. Grant Wiedenfeld, and I'm in the weeds here trying to understand Plato's Republic. This is a second part. I'm going to give it a little more background and then focus on two criticisms that he makes in what is chapters 13 and 9 of the Waterfield translation. Um, One of the things that Robin Waterfield points out in the beginning is that the poets had a certain claim to being the educators of Greece. And so the one reason he speculates why Plato and Socrates come out so harshly against poetry is because they're really competing for who is going to handle education for our people. Um, and so behind these criticisms of poetry is really putting forth the idea that philosophy is a better form of education uh, and is better for training people for government, train them in philosophy rather than in, theater or storytelling. Um, so you'll see this theme of the greater good as being more important than wealth, which is of course very appealing to Christian readers later, but nevertheless, there you'll see the classism of Plato, who was himself of kind of a noble family, aristocratic, and his idea of specialization. There's this idea that there's one, you know, the specialization of being a higher class, and who deserves to be educated rulers. So there's kind of there are numerous contradictions that run through the text there. Um, and also just thinking about another thing that's interesting to think about in the background is classical style, especially neoclassical style that would have come about in like the 17th, 18th century. But a big, Plato and Aristotle had a big influence there. Um, so the just think about that when we get to his criticisms of, poetry that's appealing to the lower part of one's mind, that's appealing to emotions rather than reason. Here, this is a sense of classical order, balance, more focused on understanding than on feeling. Okay, um, so this lecture is organized into three parts. The first two parts cover his criticism that poetry focuses on appearance more than reality or truth, uh, both in what's chapter 13 of Wakefield and the cave allegory that comes in chapter 9. And then the last part of the lecture is on the idea that the arts promote the passions or the emotions more than reason. Okay, so first, in chapter 13 of Waterfield, is book 10 of the 1578 Geneva edition. Very in-depth criticism of the arts that really follows on something that was brought up in chapter 4, but in a different way. So in chapter 4, you may remember that there's this idea of what is better. There's, stories that are told, the epic form of Homer, or stories that are acted out, tragedy or comedy. And he says telling is better. Now, you'll notice here there's a little bit of difference when we start in this later chapter. Okay, so he refers back to, the issue of poetry is the main consideration, which convinces me that the way we were trying to found our community was along the right lines. And, Glaucon, what are you thinking of? Oh, yeah, remember back in chapter 4 that we flatly refused to admit any representational poetry. Well, this is wrong. In fact, it wasn't a flat refusal. He said that, more epic and telling than acting. But anyhow, this becomes a way to lead into the main point here in the next paragraph. It looks as though this whole genre of poetry deforms its audience's minds, unless they have the antidote, which is understanding what poetry is. He's criticizing tragedy here. They trace their lineage back to Homer. Okay, and here's where the contradiction is, because Homer had been on the side of the epic versus the tragic and comic. So that's where I and Waterfield point this out too, is a bit of a contradiction. So deforming the mind. What's the problem with representation? So yeah, you see on the next page here. Can you tell me what representation basically is? Now, I believe that the word representation here is also sometimes translated as mimesis, which has at its root the same as to mime, to imitate, to copy. And so that might be useful to think for this section, where he gets the idea that representation is so close to copying. You know, the word itself, mimesis, there is built on this idea of miming or mirroring. Okay, interesting thing that comes up here, a couple paragraphs down. All right, shall we get the inquiry going by drawing on familiar ideas? Our usual position is, as you know, that any given plurality of things which have a single name constitutes a single specific type. So here the idea that the name of a thing is a type. To know if you know the name of something, then you understand a general type. And here, this is the idea of types and tokens, is one way that it's talked about. Also in times, a general form versus a particular instance. And the example that he brings up here are, let's talk about furniture. A bed, for instance. There's, a general type of bed, the form of a bed, which is, some soft, flat cushion on which people sleep. That's the form of a bed. That's the type of a bed. Any particular bed that gets made is going to look different. No one bed is the bed, the ideal bed, the archetype of bed. No, everyone is just a token of that archetype. And he uses an example of bed or table here, and so to know, knowing the name of a bed, you being able to recognize it seems a bit obvious because it's a familiar name. But when you think about the more scientific names that follow this, something like Homo sapiens, well, if you know that word Homo sapiens, it's like a thinking being. If you know that name, then you know what's special about humans as opposed to other kinds of creatures out there. If you know this name, Homo sapiens, then you know that knowledge is what makes them different, and so forth. Okay, without dwelling on that, let's get to his point here. First, he brings up the example in the top. Imagine the quickest method is to get hold of a mirror and carry it around everywhere. I skipped a little part here where he says, describes what you'd be creating: the sun, heavenly bodies, the earth, yourself, and all other creatures, plants, and so on. If you hold up a mirror, it's as if you were creating all of those things in the mirror. Glaucon makes a good point. I'd be creating appearances, not actual real things. All right, and here Socrates says that's presumably the kind of craftsman a painter is. His creations aren't real, although he is creating something, and that's the appearance of a bed. So now there's going to be a comparison here between a painter and a joiner. A joiner being the name for, kind of an ancient name for a carpenter, someone who joins pieces of wood together. Here I found, an example of a reenactment online, making a stool. And so, the joiner, the carpenter, they know what it is to be a bed or a table, or in this case, a stool. They have to understand what a stool is. It's some sort of, flat surface with a number of legs on it. If you're going to make this thing, you have to know what it is. So Socrates uses this comparison to criticize the painter who's making things that he doesn't know. So here he says, what about a joiner who specializes in making beds? What he makes is a particular bed, not the type. Yes. Okay. Now jumping forward a little bit, this argument comes all together then, and he says, we've got 3 beds. There's the real one. That's the ideal type. For Plato, reality is not what we see and feel. Reality is, that archetype that only exists in God's mind and God's knowledge. That's the real one, the product of divine craftsmanship. Then there's the one that the joiner makes. And then there's the one that the painter makes, the image of a bed. So Socrates is saying there's 3 degrees of reality here. The top one being, the divine one, the ideal, the token that's actual, that's made by the joiner, and then the appearance that's made by the painter. And he elaborates here, and he says that the representer is 2 generations or 2 degrees away from reality. So you have the real one, then you have the one the joiner makes, which is a copy of the real one, and then the one the painter makes, which is a copy of the copy. So he's saying, painting and poetry and all the arts are bad because it's a copy of a copy, a simulation of a simulation, which in his understanding of reality is farther from the truth. As a side note here, it's also a little bit interesting that he's putting the artisan as in a somewhat higher level, because he doesn't seem to care about artisans that much, or think that they're all capable of reason in general. They're not part of the guardian class, but I'll leave that to the side. Okay, so he's saying appearances are the lowest quality here. It's a superficial kind of way of knowing things. He gives another example here, thinking about paintings. Whether you look at a bed from the side or straight on or whatever, it's still just as much a bed as it ever was. I mean, it doesn't actually alter it at all. It just appears to be different, doesn't it? The same goes for anything else. Yes. Now think about a painting. A painting is, each painting is copying merely the appearance. It's just going to give you one angle on something. It's not going to give you that thing from all the different angles. So this example is again showing him that, painting doesn't really get to the essence of the thing. It's only showing it to you from one angle. So down here he says, it follows the representation truth. Representer is capable of making every product there is only because his contact with things is slight, superficial, and is restricted to how they look. The painter doesn't have a clue about shoemaking or joinery. So, for an example, consider Van Gogh's bedroom here. For Socrates, he would say this isn't teaching us anything about the bed. We can't learn anything about the bed from this. This is only giving us the appearance of the bed. In fact, how it feels, how the bedroom feels here, not how it actually is. And perhaps that's true. And Van Gogh might say, I'm not trying to teach you anything about beds or how to make beds. You're missing the point, Socrates. So his point, though, is that painters are not experts. And so we shouldn't rely on paintings and stories for learning about the world. And whether we're trying to learn about it or not, it's going to give us a deformed picture. So then he goes on this another kind of tangent where he attacks the greatest poet of them all, Homer. He's a great poet, but he says, what did he really know? Was he really an expert in anything? Was he an expert at making ceramics or beds or stuff? No. Was he a great medical doctor? No. Was he a great warrior? I mean, he talks all about war and stuff, but had he ever fought? Did he didn't have any claim to be talking, telling stories about all these things? No. Or a government leader? No. So this is a big criticism for, we can't really trust these poems because they weren't written by an expert. You just got fact checked all the way down, Homer. Watch out for Socrates right here. Okay, and the second problem related to this that's gonna back up his claim is that the people listening to the stories or reading them are impressionable. It's not as necessarily children here, but just people in general. And so in the middle paragraph, he says, no, because all the same, despite his ignorance, the poet's ignorance of the good and bad aspects of things, he'll go on representing them. But what he'll be representing, apparently, is whatever appeals to a large, if ignorant, audience. Now, there's a big criticism that what the poet is appealing to is not reason, but kind of lower emotions, and the emotions, the passions, and that when you have a crowd of people, this is what dominates, are these, what is coming up in the next section, the passions, desires, rather than knowledge. All right. So this is bad education in some. It's appealing to the dumb aspects of people and making them dumber. We're going to see this again with Horkheimer and Adorno and a more sophisticated argument when they talk about the culture industry. Okay, now, before I get to his second criticism on the passions, there's another important part of the Republic where he talks about appearance versus reality, and that's the allegory of the cave. It comes in Book 7 of the Old Geneva edition, Chapter 9 in the Waterfield translation. It's not about poetry, but just appearance in general versus knowledge. And you'll see why it's evident to cinema, though, when we get into it. Okay, it's a kind of a thought experiment. He has a couple of them in this chapter. And Socrates says, here's a situation which you can use as an analogy for the human condition, for our education or lack of it. Imagine people living in a cavernous cell down under the ground. At the far end of the cave, a long way off, there's an entrance open to the world, open to the outside world. They've been there inside this cell since childhood, locked up, their legs and necks tied up in a way which keeps them from one place and allows them to look only straight ahead, but not to turn their head. So they don't get to go outside. They're just staring at the back of the cave wall. There's a firelight burning a long way further up the cave behind them, and up the slope between the fire and the prisoners, there's a road beside which you should imagine a low wall has been built, which conjurers, magicians, place themselves and their audience between themselves and their audience. Okay, so here's one illustration of this that I found online, and so we have the cave. On the left there, you see the back of the cave wall is what the people you can see two of them sitting against the wall there. Their bare arms. They're the ones who are chained up against that wall. They can't see to the outside of the world. They can only look at the wall here and nowhere else. This is their whole world are these appearances in front of them. And who's behind them who's behind that wall? These conjurers, these magicians. You can see it's basically a shadow play that they're watching, and that's in a way the only world that they know until later imagine that one escapes, and that's the figure going up to the top. Imagine that one escapes. Well, I'll come back to this in a second, but okay, he continues describing people behind the wall carrying all sorts of artifacts, human statuettes, animal models, and so forth. Jumping down, they're no different from us. I mean, in the first place, do you think they'd see anything of themselves and one another except the shadows cast by the fire onto the cave wall directly opposite them? No, they're supposed to spend their lives without moving their heads. Okay, now suppose they were able to talk to one another. Don't you think they'd assume that their words applied to what they saw in front of them? So if they heard, if they heard things, they would associate the sound with these shadow puppets as well. And the way the allegory plays out, he says, imagine if someone escaped. What would happen? Well, they would be blinded by the light. And so you see the figure on the top right up there. He's shielding, he's putting his arm up to shield himself from the light, or herself. Blinded by the light, confused, and in fact, because they've only known this shadow world, when they got out into reality, they would be like, oh, I'm all confused. Like, this doesn't make any sense. I must be dreaming. This is all wrong. But, kind of Stockholm syndrome, because they've been down in this false world all the time, they can't, they can't recognize what truth is. It's going to take a long time. And then the second thing that Plato imagines is say, okay, imagine they spend a lot of time out there. They realize that they were living in this false world, and then they come back in. They come back down. Well, they're not going to be able to see at first. It's going to be all dark. And basically, everyone who's living in this false world and listens to them is going to say, hey, you're crazy. We're living in reality here. You say this is false, but no, you're the one. You're wrong. It's false. It's false what you're talking about up there. You just went and got your eyes all burnt out. You can't even see these shadows well anymore. You don't know anything at all. So it's this contrast between living in a false world and a real world. And if you're in the false world, you don't recognize it. This sense of being in a cave and being prisoner to your own illusions. And then this, the light is the sense of knowledge for him, symbol of knowledge, and coming into the light, gaining knowledge, being woken up, being woke. These all fall into here. This kind of this false world then versus seeing the truth. Okay. Third part is this other criticism that he levels, which is related to the problem of appearances, and that's that poetry, it distorts the mind because instead of appealing to truth, the reason why it's deviating from truth is because it wants to feed the passions, the lower part of the mind. Passions is not the word that they use in this translation, but I kind of like it. The passions, the desires, so forth. So Okay, back here in chapter 13, we can agree that not only does painting, or rather representation in general, produce a product which is far from truth, but it also forms a close, warm, affectionate relationship with a part of us that is, in turn, far from intelligence. And nothing healthy or authentic can emerge from this relationship. Nothing healthy or authentic? Okay, no holds barred here. But so it's this affection here is the problem, and he's saying that poetry is not after truth; it's after affect, the emotions. Okay, kind of goes on to illustrate these two parts of the mind by kind of imagining how people react to death and kind of grief, and how poets like Homer, they have these long speeches about grief that are making people cry. Don't want boys to cry, the guardians to cry, which comes up in chapter 4. Same idea is repeated here. He makes a little analogy at the beginning. When children bump into things, they clutch the hurt spot and spend time crying. Instead of behaving like that, we should constantly be training our minds to waste no time before trying to heal anything which is unwell and help anything which has fallen to get up from the floor, to banish mourning by means of medicine. Okay, so quit your crying and get back to work. This is how you're supposed to approach life. This is what's moral and goodness is to focus on the job of purpose and the greater good rather than wallowing in one's emotions. So what's interesting is that Socrates sees these two almost as opposed and totally different parts of the mind. The reason versus the passions, the emotions. And what's interesting is down here in the second part, he says that, in fact, it's easier to represent the emotions. So now, although the petulant part of us is rich in variety of representable possibilities, the intelligent and calm side of our characters is pretty well constant and unchanging. This makes it not only difficult to represent, but also difficult to understand when it is represented, particularly when the audience is the kind of motley crowd you find crammed into a theater, because they're simply not acquainted with the experience that's being represented to them. Okay, so again, this image of the dumb crowd, that they are more attracted to and stimulated by the emotional qualities of things than the rational side. And that, in fact, the rational side of things is difficult to represent because it's unchanging. It's not the surface, but some kind of deep, anchor that's not moving. And there's certainly something to be said here. There's certainly some truth to that. One of the interesting things here is that this whole time, remember, Plato is writing in dialogues here. He could have just come out and said these things, but instead he decided to represent these philosophers in a dramatic situation of Glaucon and Adeimantus talking to Socrates. So maybe these Socratic dialogues are what he thinks is the good form of poetry, rather than that's more focused on philosophy rather than emotions. But it's also interesting that he bothers to use this form at all. So I'll just mention this. Maybe that his dialogues themselves are what he's getting after. This is how you represent, the constant character is through these arguments, philosophical arguments. And he goes on here to say that a representational poet has nothing to do with this part of the mind, the rational part. His skill isn't made for its pleasure, but because otherwise he'd lose his popular appeal. He's concerned with the petulant and varied side of our characters because it is easy to represent. Okay, notice here that there's two kinds of pleasures. There's this sense of there's an intellectual pleasure, that's the pleasure of reason and knowledge, and it's a certain constancy. And then there's another pleasure that has to do with the varied side of life, that's more superficial and easier to represent. Okay, place this poet, the storyteller, in the same category as the painter, because they fall short of the truth. And he doesn't fit in this ideal community. The last line: he destroys the rational part of the mind by feeding and fattening up this other part. And this is equivalent to someone destroying the more civilized members of a community by presenting ruffians with political power. So there's a political, the focus of the book is on politics. And so obviously there's a connection here between what kind of effect does it have on the mind overall to, be consuming a lot of stories. That there's this bad system of government in people's mind by gratifying their irrational side. So that, this theme of bad education, that poetry is irrigating, is cultivating the desires so that people feel things more strongly, and they're being overcome by their feelings. They're laughing too hard at things, and they just want to laugh too hard. They're crying too hard and can't get up and act anymore. Or they're overcome with sexual pleasure and are not, going to work or thinking about things clearly, or whatever else they should be doing for the good of everyone. They're just focused on their own pleasure, or their own pain, but their own sensations. There's too much in the body, not enough in the mind. He reinforces this idea of being ruled here in a couple pages later. Exactly the same kind of behavior we uncovered when talking about feeling sad. There's a part of you which wants people laugh. Here he's talking about the kind of the social effect. If everybody starts to act this way, then everyone will start to act like comedians. And the same goes for sex, anger, and all the desires and feelings of pleasure and distress, which we're saying accompany everything we do. Poetic representation has the same effect. It irrigates and tends to these things when they should be left to wither. And it makes them our rulers when they should be our subjects. Because otherwise we won't live better and have happier lives, but quite the opposite. So happiness for him is the sense of moderation, controlling the passions, both having a rational knowledge of how the world is and focusing on the purpose and the goals that are trying to be achieved. And he sees emotions as obstructing that because they're focused on pleasure and pain versus this rational purpose. Last part of this chapter is a nice turn. As hard as he's been on poetry, then he says, well, prove me wrong. Like, I'm open to it. I want to listen to your counter arguments. We'd love to have people who champion poetry because they like it, to speak on its behalf and to prove that there's more to poetry than mere pleasure, and that it also has a beneficial effect on society and on human life in general. And we'd like to be proven wrong because we like poetry. So if there's, love to have some better reasons here, but he seems to believe that he's going to be a long time waiting. Now, Aristotle, Plato's student, responds to this in one way, and we'll see that it's that, rather than being 2 degrees from the ideal, his idea is that fiction does represent the ideal, the type, um, and that uh, this appeal to the emotions can be useful. It's a way of catharsis is the word he uses, which can be translated either as kind of purging the emotions or purifying them and kind of understanding them better. So there are some strong arguments from Aristotle and many others on why poetry and storytelling and film and cinema with it are beneficial.